it may be, there are people who are willing to commit acts of evil to protect themselves.
I also, here's what I think. There was a book called Ordinary Men that was talking about various SS groups and Einsatzen groups and whatnot within the Nazis. And that is, of course, everyone's kind of favorite one to reference. But one of the things they talked about is that, and Jordan Peterson talks about this a lot, where it's this idea that we have this idea, well, that was somebody else, that was over there was something wrong with them, they were psychopaths, they were like, no, they weren't. They were ordinary people. Like if you were not cognizant of your own individual capacity for evil, then you're not going to actually do the correct things that you need to do in order to combat against that. The other thing that I think is important is the greatest evil is not, people have this idea, and this is kind of a leftist trope, that the greatest evil is perpetrated for the quest for power or the quest for greed or the quest for wealth. No, it isn't. The greatest evils are always a result of somebody that honestly believes that they're doing something for the greater good. And C.S. Lewis had this quote once. I'm going to butcher it. I'm not going to get it totally right, but C.S. Lewis had this quote where he was basically saying it would be better to be ruled by, greedy robber barons than it would by moral busybodies. And his whole idea is that the moral busybodies will torment you without end because they do so with the approval of their own conscience. And there's nothing more dangerous than somebody that honestly believes that I have to do this to you for your own good, or I have to do this to this other person for the greater good. And that's what's really terrifying. It's the person that's greedy or the person that's just quest for power. They can get a little power, they can get a little money, and they might be okay for a while. But my gosh, be leery of the moral busybody that is doing all of this to save the world.
There's also another component of it, which we talk about quite a bit. And that is these CBP officers took a deal with the devil. The assumption most people make when they hear about the Faustian deal is you get offered your greatest desires. You want to be a rock star? You want to be an astronaut? You want to be famous? You want to be rich and successful and everyone will love you? Then cut the deal with the devil. The reality is it's much simpler than that. The devil shows up when your child is hungry and says, serve the army of evil, and your child will know nothing but a full belly.
But the devil will say, serve the army of good, and you'll be fed and you'll be wealthy.
No.
And you'll be like, how is any of this wrong? All I've got to do is destroy the roaches over there.
No, that's the scary thing, is that these CBP agents know when they take that child, the number on their arm, they are selling a child into sex slavery. And you ask yourself, for what? For what is it worth? Your $1,000 paycheck? Must be. And the guy saying to himself, I got kids, man. These CBP agents would rather transport an innocent child to sex slavers than see their own children go hungry. That is the deal with the devil. I don't understand how we're months into this story being true and we still have people working for CBP. It's insane. Maybe many of them quit. I have no idea. We've heard so many stories about good cops quitting. We had a couple cops on the culture war who talked about how they got pushed out because they were good cops refusing. One guy said they tried to get him to write up a fake warrant. And he says, no, they boot him out. Mm-hmm. You don't play the game. You don't do the evil deed. You're out. And it's no surprise we have so many bad cops. One of the cops we had on here, this guy Chris, said that leftists fabricated racist posts, and the mayor just said, "You're all fired. Don't care."
Yeah,
literally don't care. How is it that there could be a person right now wearing a CBP badge, knowing what they're doing? I have honestly no idea.
I think. Well, I'll take a crack at that. If you are a CBP agent and you're nowhere near this component, right? Because not everybody in CBP is doing the same job. And you're in a BORTAC unit, right? Or you're doing something like that where you're going out there and you do your job and you think you're doing it well. And you may be frustrated with somebody else and what they're doing in the organization or the agency, but you're still going to do your job. And because you could say the same thing about the military, you could say the same thing about, any sort of large metropolitan police department. I get where you're coming from, because it's the idea of at what point does it taint you just being associated with the organization? And at what point, by the same token, you can see someone rationally making the argument that if the good guys aren't doing the job, then the only thing that's left are the bad guys. And that's the part where, my dad was LAPD for 20 years. And he got out in 2000, I think. Had a massive stroke on the job and had to medically retire. I remember wanting to get out of the military at that point. This was, I'd only been a couple years, like 98 and to 2000, and I was getting out because I didn't like being in a peacetime army, and it was boring. And I was going to go be LAPD, and he goes, "Don't do it." And he saw some of the changes that were happening in the department. And one of the things he told me, he goes, Nick, people get the police they ask for. And right now they are asking for a police department that wants to show up and write reports after you're hurt. Because if you try to show up and intervene, you're going to potentially lose your job. You're going to, your kids, how are you going to pay your bills? How are you going to pay your mortgage? And there's something to that, right? You will, the institutions, we have this idea, and I really do think that we've grown up in some degree. I hate to use the word privilege because it's been, co-opted, but there's a certain degree of complacency that comes with the sort of relative wealth, prosperity, security that we experience within the United States. And you have people that grow up thinking that this is just the way it's supposed to be. This is the natural order of things. This is about as far from the natural order of things in human history as anything. And then you have people that think that they can just throw out the underlying objective morality or the underlying objective philosophies which made these things, the prosperity and the security, possible. And you can just kind of pick and choose like a buffet. And then you end up with something like this, where you've got people celebrating what's going on the border right now because they honestly think it's a representation of tolerance.
Yeah. And
it's nuts. It's like, this is not just good. And again, someone sees me saying it like, oh yeah, he's a white dude. Of course he's a bigot. Yeah, I am worried about a bunch of people just flooding into the country because if you don't actually have sovereign borders, that's pretty damn problematic. But I'll tell you what I'm also worried about. I'm worried about some parent in, Ecuador, that when they saw the DACA regulations go into place, they thought to themselves, oh my gosh, I can give my kids a better future. Well, how do you facilitate that? Do you go to a travel agent and just book a flight for your kid? No. You work with the legal organizations, you work with cartels because they're the only ones that control border access. And you're trying to do the right thing by your kid, and now your kid's sold into sex slavery. Because we had a policy in the United States that really sounded good on paper, but that's what it produces in reality. And then when you show them the reality, it doesn't matter because the ideological train has already left the station and it ain't coming back.
Mm-hmm. You've lured everyone into a dangerous situation, right? You've put American citizens at risk because we're not enforcing border policies and we're potentially exposing their communities to more crime than they actually need to be exposed to.
Yes.
And you're also hurting children who are sent away with no one to advocate for them. And in fact, anyone along the journey could say, hey, you're vulnerable and I'm going to take advantage of that.
Oh, absolutely. That we know they do it. We know they do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What were you saying?
I was just going to say, but they say, oh, but they're fleeing something. This is better for them, right? Like, how can the Biden administration say, knowing that this even happens to one child, that this is a policy worth enforcing?
Well, they've incentivized it. Like, they've incentivized this behavior. It's not just that they allow it, they incentivize it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when Kamala Harris said come, or they were like, come to the United States, I think they made a proclamation in 2020.
She said, don't come.
Yeah.
Then later she said, don't come.
Yeah.
But
when
first
she was
they were
running,
saying come.
Yeah.
Right.
And that was disappointing. But with this privilege thing you're talking about, I feel it. Like, I'm in a land of peace.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, oh yeah, I want to be nice to everyone. I don't want to hurt anything. I don't want to kill that invading species. I don't want to. I'm talking about animals like humans are animals too, but like raccoons and shit. Like, I don't want to kill it, but like, that's my privilege. I don't have to. I have walls. I don't have to go kill the bear because I have walls to protect me.
Right. And this is what you got with, like,
So you're saying build the wall. 40 feet tall.
Everyone should have walls, access to walls.
Look, good fences make good neighbors. I think that's a good thing. I mean, but this is what we saw with especially, I think of like East Coast cities that were like, no, the border should be open. You should let them in. We should all be sanctuary cities. And then once the brunt of illegal immigration hit them, think about New York City. They were like, federal government, we need support. I mean, the governor, the mayor, they have asked for support, and the Biden administration has said no, and they are suffering the consequences. In fact, they're trying to hoist the effects of this onto neighboring counties around them. But when it didn't affect them, it was okay if it happened to border communities in Texas and Arizona. But when it started to affect them, someone had to step in.
But you notice even then, right? It wasn't like, oh gosh, now we're suffering the consequences of our actions. Maybe we should reconsider our policies. No, it was, hey, federal government, give us more stuff. Right? It's never let's reconsider the policies.
And approve work permits faster.
Yeah.
Make it easier for someone to stay here. Don't even consider deportation.
Yeah.
For the cities taking them in, they were, instead of saying, hey, change the policy so this stops happening, they were like, give us money to facilitate it.
Yes. Yeah. Or they were going to their own citizens and saying, sorry, your kids can't show up to school today because we've got to house people that are here illegally.
Which is like kind of a Third Amendment violation.
So, sorry, homeless people who are here, there's no space in the shelter for you anymore.
Yeah.
Or your businesses are being shut down to facilitate illegals. That doesn't make any sense. And that seems like a constitutional violation.
I don't see how there is a country. Like, the polls are looking really great for Donald Trump. With RFK Jr. running, we'll see. But even then, it's going to be a challenge. If Trump wins and Republicans take the Senate, Congress, and they do have, to a certain degree, the Supreme Court, there's still going to be massive backlash. Michael Malice pointed this out. He said, don't you think if Donald Trump were to win and try to enact this deportation, that California and New York's governors would mobilize their National Guard and say no?
I don't know that they would go that far. I think they would. I think in a more subtle ways they would resist it, and they would do enough to actually make it very, very difficult to do the deportation piece. The biggest thing I'm worried about is the federal bureaucracy, because people think that when the president gets in there, he can just fire. You can fire people in the executive branch, right? You're the chief executive. No, you can't. Right. There's a relatively small number of people that you can actually get rid of. And you're right. You're going to have states that actually resist that, some more subtly, some more overtly. But if we can't do something to tackle the massive federal bureaucracy in the same kind of way that Javier Milei is doing in Argentina right now, if you can't do that, forget it. The bureaucracy will wait. They can last out 4 years of Trump. Right, they can slow roll stuff.
You're saying Milei the president in Argentina has way more power
over the executive branch, yeah.
So he was able to cut, 14? He just cut 14 government agencies of 23 down to 9?
Just got rid of 22 to 9 ministries. Like, you're gone now. 70,000 government employees, we're firing you.
That's the value of small governments, man. You can move real quick. Big governments become real untenable.
That's
you
the
need
thing,
decentralization.
Though, Argentina had a massive one. The difference was that their chief executive has more control over the executive branch than our president has over the executive branch. That's what it comes down to.
Let's jump to this story from the Washington Post. RFK Jr. argues Biden is bigger threat to democracy than Trump, drawing criticism. I love this subtitle. Several experts and historians rebuked the independent presidential candidate for his comments in a televised interview. Basically, what he said was, Joe Biden's going after his political opponents with criminal charges and censoring people on social media, violating the First Amendment, which is the first. And of course, uniparty establishment, corporate press media rushes out to write stories in a way. This is the secret. This story should not be written this way, drawing criticism. We had over on so timcast.com no longer has news. Now the former Timcast team is now working with scnr.com, a separate company. And when Timcast was being evaluated by NewsGuard, we ran a story that said something like, Donald Trump says X. And then it was Donald Trump at a rally today said the following, and it was like a paragraph. Trump says that when this happens, he will do this. NewsGuard asks us why we didn't fact check Donald Trump. And I said, because we're just reporting on a quote. We're not running a fact check. We're just saying Trump at a rally said he would do this thing. And they said, yeah, but the thing he was talking about was wrong. And I'm like, well, I don't know. I'm just telling people it's what he said. So they said, okay, you're fake news. They gave us a strike because we didn't fact check when we were reporting on a quote, but our reporting was 100% accurate.
He really did say that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so when you take a look at the Washington Post, look at how they do this. Mm-hmm. The story should be RFK Jr. argues Biden is a bigger threat to democracy than Donald Trump. That's it.
Yeah.
Drawing criticism. Why write a story and publish it and include your own editorial context? Because they're framing the narrative. They want to make sure that people like Ian's mom, for instance, before she actually hears what RFK Jr. had to say, she gets slammed by MSNBC, CNN, Washington Post saying, yes, he said it, but he's wrong. Here's why he's wrong.
Yeah, this will make a reader, your average reader, fire cortisol. They'll be like, okay, I'm getting ready for conflict. Let's find out what this criticism, this bad news is. And then you go into the article reading with that kind of state of mind.
RFK Jr., of course, is completely correct, though he did say Trump trying to overthrow the election clearly is a threat to democracy. But the question was, who is a worse threat? And what I would say is, I'm not going to answer that, but I can argue Biden is. So they're saying he said it, Biden was. Well, he said he could argue that he was, meaning he wasn't sure, but there were certainly arguments to be made. Here you go. And then they bring up a Harvard University political scientist and co-author of How Democracies Die, said of Kennedy's comment, it's a preposterous claim. To be a politician committed to democracy, there are two cardinal rules. One must accept election outcomes, win or lose. One must not threaten or use violence to gain power. Donald Trump has clearly violated both rules, while President Biden never has.
But he just claimed that insane. He could argue Biden is worse. Like,
Well,
That's not breaking
Biden
the
is using violence to gain power. It's called the federal government going after Trump's lawyers, and other Trump supporters. That's violence.
This is why I love what was it, the Thomas Sowell quote. He's like the single greatest thing about getting a degree from Harvard is no longer being impressed by anybody that has a degree from Harvard.
There you go.
And it's for stuff like this, and it's always an idea of how they categorize violence. It's like whenever I get invited to speak to students, I always ask them this first question. I'm like, what is the one thing that is unique about government, truly unique about government? They're like, oh, voting. I'm like, you can vote right now. Oh, well, you guys have committees. You can set up committees all you want. You make laws. I'm like, we get to use aggressive violence in order to achieve our outcomes. We're the only ones that legally can do it. But they don't consider the chief executive, the president of the United States, using the federal government agencies to essentially call up social media companies and we won't say threaten, we'll say strongly encourage them to censor people, to deplatform people, to take down certain information. You don't think that use of coercive power constitutes violence or the threat of violence? No, of course not. Why? Because they agree with it. And that's the part where, to your point, they want to use the title of objective journalism, but then they want to engage in editorialism. And like so many other things where they have just randomly changed the definition of a word, we all lose faith in something that we used to have faith in because the word meant something. It doesn't anymore. We know when we see a title like this, it's like, oh yeah, it's the Washington Post and they're going to editorialize it. And I'm not going to get the truth about what was actually said. And I'm certainly not going to get, a comprehensive from multiple perspective analysis of what was said. I'm already being told what to think about this. And this is what good people think. And if you don't think this way, then you must not be a good person.
It's a cult.
Yeah, and it depends on compliance, right? Like, I love what you're saying. If you don't think this way, then you're not a good person. At a certain point, you have to look at this other side and say, do I think I want to be a good person under your definition, right? Yeah. Like the people, the values that you think are good, the actions that you think are right, would I also agree with that? And I think when you start to really critically analyze the yardstick with which they use to measure character, you don't want to be a part of it, in my opinion.
The word good, who the hell thinks they have the power and authority to dictate what that means? It's subjective. Good, the word God, it's like the same word on purpose.
Well, I think that we should have a cultural standard. Like I wish that we had a strong enough cultural identity where we could all at the table be like, these things are good and these things are bad. And maybe in this room we could, and maybe generally across the political spectrum, there are topics where people would say, yes, I agree, that's good, and yes, I agree, that's bad. But I think really the details of this get lost. And because we don't have a strong collective identity, we don't have a shared sense of a lot of morality is dictated by religion. We're a very diverse country, and so therefore we have to really be careful about combing through and saying, well, what do we agree is right, wrong, good, evil? Because ultimately that there are good things and there are bad things, but if your neighbor has a completely different definition of these things, then you can advocate for completely different policies, which is where we are now.
And it might be the same definition, but the situation means like if you get the best, there's one sandwich and we're both hungry. We both know what it means. Good is if I get that sandwich, it's good for me. And if you get it, it's good for you. So we have to fight about whose good is going to dominate.
Unless we agreed that good was if we both weren't hungry anymore and could split the sandwich.
There are other.
But that's not fair because Ian has higher caloric requirements than you. So that's
or like if it was something you couldn't split up, like
this is why we need sandwich equity.
Yeah, that's right. Something non-fungible.
I'm just saying, if there were like ways that we could agree that there were certain outcomes that are good, but if we always see our definitions of good as in conflict with each other, then we're never going to have a compromise.
Well, and I think there's also a difference between useful and good. Like when we say good, there's more of a moral connotation to that. So in that situation, what we would do is there's one sandwich, you're both hungry, and you say no, you take the sandwich. We would agree that it was useful that she got the sandwich. We would also agree that it was good that you engage in a form of personal sacrifice to help somebody else. And so the term can be used both ways, but we would understand the different moral connotation associated with it. But we are increasingly, to your point, we're increasingly getting to a point where this idea of a certain degree of shared values is just doesn't exist anymore. We literally have half the country that doesn't believe the same thing about this country, doesn't believe the same thing about how it was founded or the fundamental principles that informed it, doesn't believe that on the whole it's been a force for good.
But they don't believe anything.
Yeah, well,
I think the important thing to understand.
You think it's just nihilism?
No. It's a cult. It is a brain dead cult. And so you take a look at what happens to somebody when they start reading. Yannick Kasparian's a really great example. She reads a story about people in Long Island who have cut up two people or who are accused of. They were found in a home with blood and guts in the drains, body parts strewn across all over the house and scattered around Long Island. And when the police arrest them for these crimes, they said they're not bail eligible and let them go. What happens? The left attacks her for it because she's deviating from the cult. So there's a viral video among the left right now, massively viral, where Haya Reichik of Libs of TikTok was at university, I believe, and some guy in the back laughs at something she says, and she goes, "You have a question?" He goes, "Yeah, how do you define woke?" And she couldn't do it. She said it's like anti-normalcy, and it's like, didn't have a good answer. And I think for a lot of people, they can sort of understand when they see something that is woke what it is, because it's almost a root word itself.